Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui in Beijing. According to the National Bureau of Statistics, China's economy grew at an annual rate of 6.7% in the 3 months to September, which is a sign that growth is stabilizing. Some analysts hold negative predictions of China's economic performance, while others are still confident in China's leading role in the global economy. So what exactly is China's current economic situation? What will be the main incentive measures China should take in the future? How should China and the United States cooperate with each other to improve the world's economy? To discuss these issues and more, I'm happy to be joined in the studio by Yukang Huang, a senior associate at the Carnegie Endowment, and Charles Liu, founder of How Capital. But before we begin our discussion, let's take a look at this.
Still growing, but still slowing. The latest official figures suggest China's economic growth is stabilizing at 6.7%. That's 3 quarters in a row with the same figure. Based on that, full-year growth for 2016 is still likely to be weaker than last year's, which was already the slowest in 25 years. The general performance was better than expected, the National Bureau of Statistics said in a statement. The figure is in line with Beijing's growth target of 6.5% to 7% for the year. According to the Political Bureau of the Communist Party of China Central Committee, the stable growth of China's economy was driven by rapid high-tech sector development, strong service sector growth, a stable financial market, and better-than-expected employment. Real estate has also been a driving force behind China's economy this year. Although the housing price is on the rise, people are still enthusiastic about investing in the property market. In Shanghai, people waited at midnight for the opening ceremony of an apartment complex. In Hefei, people rushed into a sales office having received a priority lottery ticket to pick their first choice of apartment. In case of property bubbles, provincial governments put forward strict rules to curb the heat of speculation, with some cities demanding bigger mortgages or banning second homes. Meanwhile, the Chinese economy is rapidly rebalancing towards services, which now account for 50% of China's GDP, up from 42% 10 years ago, according to World Bank data. This continuing shift may indicate the government's planned move towards services, innovation and household consumption as a result of the new economic drivers going to plan.
Welcome to Dialogue, gentlemen. What do you think of the latest official figure concerning the GDP growth?
Well, it's almost getting boring. 6.7, 3 quarters in a row.
Again and again and again, 3 times for
so
consecutive
is this good
run.
news or bad news? I think it's a sign that things are leveling out. But the fact that it may go a little bit lower or a little bit higher is not the major issue. China's growth rate, if you compare it with, let's say, 100 major economies, is actually very, very high, relatively speaking. So I think it's a sign that this country is probably on the point of perhaps turning it around a little bit.
Charles?
6.7 compared to negative rates in many parts of Europe and the United States looking at, 0.2% last quarter. It's substantial. But I think so much of China's economy is tied to the global economy. So whatever happens outside is seriously impacting on the situation in China. I think one has to look at the possibility of further slowdowns in other parts of the world, including Japan and Europe, and that will impact on the Chinese economy.
Now, Mr. Huang, you said in one of your recent articles about the Chinese economy that the biggest and dangerous enemy of our economic performance would actually be the global public opinion. What do you mean by that?
Well, let's look at expectations. 7 or 8 years ago, China accounted for 50% of global expansion. That's unheard of in the midst of the global financial crisis. Today, it accounts for a quarter. So is this good or bad? In some comparative sense, it's much lower than before, but in an absolute sense, it is quite positive. So expectations have to adjust to the fact that this is a different world. There are many who still are concerned about China's trade surpluses. They're still very substantial. And in a situation where the world is slowing down, there are some people who actually say, well, why is China still generating 2 to 3% trade surpluses? And then there's a big debate. Is China now the leading global economic power, or is it the United States? This shapes public opinions. And I think they shape public opinions in many ways. And I think China has to realize that in any foreign policy discussions, any economic policies, public perceptions do shift, and they do change how people look at China.
Mr. Huang called the public opinions. Actually, they are more about sentiments. And sentiments sound like loose sand. For that, whatever buildings are likely to collapse.
I think from those on the ground doing investments, what we see sentiment is market sentiment, or the flow of capital. Capital is one big pool for this whole world. It flows here, it flows there. There is a Great Wall of China which blocks hot money's flow, but they do penetrate, they do come, and foreign direct investment too. If you have a negative sentiment, capital leaves, which may not be very good for the economy. If you have a positive sentiment, capital is injected, may be good for the economy.
Are you talking about confidence of both consumers and investors?
I'm talking basically about investors, or those who manage the flow of capital. And it's not central banks, it's private institutions, investment funds, fund managers. If there is if the prevailing trend is for negativity, they not only will put their money out, but they will short the market, which will create havoc for the stability of the Chinese economy.
Mr. Huang, do you have any official statistics or figures of your own about the Chinese government's input in the fixed assets? What do you think of the allegation that we see too much credit bubbles in the real estate market? And what do you think of local debt?
Well, we know, of course, from the figures that private investment has become much lower than it has 3 or 4 or 5 years ago. A lot of the investment is in infrastructure, driven by local governments. Some of it has been in construction, but that's considerably less than it used to be. State enterprises are under a lot of pressure to invest. So much more of the investments going on is driven by the state sector. And a lot of it is showing up in excess capacity in certain sectors, and people worry about it. This shows up also in China's debt to GDP ratio. China's debt to GDP ratio is 250% of GDP. It used to be
some would put it at 260%.
Some even higher, but it was 100% points lower 8 or 9 years ago. But what's actually quite interesting is if you line up all the countries in the world, China's debt to GDP ratio is right in the middle. It's higher than most developing, and it's lower than most developed. Now, if you had to guess, that's probably what you would guess where China should be. It's neither a developing country nor is it a developed. So in that sense, its debt to GDP ratio is not the concern. What is the concern is that it increased so rapidly in such a short period of time. And this basically relates to the property market, because property prices have soared. And a lot of credit, directly, indirectly, has been financing the soaring prices for property. So then the big question is somewhat different. Not so much a property bubble, a debt bubble, but whether or not there's a property bubble in China. And that you really can't tell sometimes until you look back. And that's the problem with bubbles. You don't know until afterwards.
And just to add one other element there in terms of the properties bubble, China is not one market. China is many markets. And in fact, it's not one big bubble. It's more like many bubbles, small bubbles here and there. Whether or not there's a bubble in Beijing, I think one would really argue hard. There isn't a bubble in Beijing.
Because of the robust demand for first home and the second home, for the improvement of the housing
and the population in Beijing have the income to do the purchasing. So, but in some third-tier cities, fourth-tier cities, it's hard to say. So I think, unlike in, let's say, a developed country like the United States, where you have these pooled mortgages, and you have the Fannie Mae's and also the derivatives on the mortgage pools, it becomes one financial market. China is not one financial market. It's broken into many, many markets.
And the segmentation is really unusual. I mean, if you go to Shenzhen, where prices have soared a lot, it is very clear there are shortages there. And so it's understandable why prices have soared. If you come to Beijing, certainly within, let's say, the 3rd or 4th ring road, there really isn't a bubble. There's actually a shortage. It's hard actually to find projects that you can actually purchase. But if you go out to the 5th, 6th, 7th, you actually do see areas where you say, well, maybe they've overbuilt a bit. So even in Beijing, it's a little bit more segmented. In Shanghai, you have a rather unusual situation. Shanghai, the density of people living in the central portions of Shanghai have actually declined over the last 10 years, which is quite unusual, because Shanghai has actually been pushing people further out. And that changes also the property market. So you have all these kinds of extreme variations across the country, and it's hard to actually know what's going on for the country as a whole.
You've been discussing three issues, basically. One is the public opinions, the confidence, as well as ratio. Now, which would come across as the most dangerous in, for example, causing systematic financial risks in China? Because this is the very issue that people have been talking about that may have led to more of the, what we call outbound flight of capital.
So I think there are ways of addressing each of them. For example, the housing bubble, the government is taking various measures to control the explosive rise of prices, and it's beginning to have an impact.
Excuse me, let me break in. A few months ago, when I was in Boao Forum for Asia, I was present at one of the very interesting closed-door deliberations, and they were talking about housing prices. One of the most outspoken guy who died, unfortunately, after the Boao Forum, pointed out that, ironically, whenever the government stepped in to interfere with the housing market, there would be a surge in the housing prices. Right. And the government seemed to have lost control every time, without exceptions. He was lashing out. He was so critical of the government's role. What do you think of the relationship between the government and the market in the real estate sector?
I think for the government, it's always a question of trial and error. They try different things. If it works, it works. It doesn't work, actually it goes in a negative way. Now, the minute the government announces that there's going to be crackdown on housing prices, then the developers would go on a big rampage and getting people to buy. You don't do it, it's going to be more difficult to buy a second house, it's going to be more difficult to invest in real estate. So I think it is trial and error by the government. It's just like their trial and error on the stock market. It was really trial and error in terms of how to regulate or how to manage the stability in the marketplace.
Let's take a closer look at the politics in its relationship with the market. With the recent conclusion of the 6th plenary session of the 18th National Congress of the CPC Central Committee, and particularly the release of draconian regulations about the behavior of the Communist Party members, many of whom would be the CEO and the executives of the SOE sector. And against the backdrop of the high-handed anti-graft campaign, without the adoption of incentives to reward behavior or good behavior of the SOE executives, what would that mean? Would that wreak havoc with the public sector? If that's the case, if that were to be the case, what would be the sustainability, if any, of the economic performance?
I have 2 points on this. Number one, SOEs are inefficient.
Inefficient.
That's right.
But
they're inefficient.
Indispensable, perhaps.
Indispensable, maybe, if they're made into doing the sectors that must be national in nature. For example, some aspects of or the state grid or whatever, it cannot be a real public market competition. There has to be a centralized or focused entity that does it. But generally speaking, state-owned enterprises are inefficient, and it's very difficult to talk about rewarding management of monopolistic entities which are inefficient. But I think the other point that I would
But the core issue, I'm afraid, is the productivity of the SOE.
Exactly, because it's inefficient, its productivity is lower than anywhere else. But it also serves a purpose. I think the party plenum, even though it didn't address the issue, the direction is very clear, that the SOEs will become more like government entities rather than private businesses. And that is the direction that the central government is leading toward. The other aspect, as for party members, I think the thing that I've noticed in my 27 years of doing business in China is the greatest ideas in the central government, when it goes down to the local level, it doesn't get implemented. One very simple reason. For example, environmental protection. You go to a local mayor, you must shut down these polluting factories. What about unemployment issues for me then? What about GDP growth issues for me then? So there are some contradictions or divergences of objectives in terms of the central government and the local government. I think this is one of the aspects that maybe the party plenum is trying to address. If you're a party member, you have to be disciplined in following the overall, the macro perspective of what the central
The
government
price we
would
have
like
to
to
pay
see.
for low carbon development as well as massive unemployment arising from traditional segments of the industry would have to be the painful price we pay
Yes.
for the evolution as well as learning curve of a big developing country such as China. Thank you very much, gentlemen. You are watching Dialogue with Yukon Charles Liu. When we come back, we'll look at perhaps the political issue of massive unemployment due to the alleged deep capacity of the labor-intensive manufacturing industry that we enjoy the dividends of which during the past decades. I'll see you when we come back. Please stay tuned. Welcome back, gentlemen. Let's look at the issue of unemployment. Premier Li Keqiang said in the keynote presentation at the opening ceremony of the NPC, I mean the top legislature in Beijing in the spring, that his administration is determined to fix the issue of employment by providing up to 10 million jobs. And last year, before October, he was able to provide 11 million or 12 million even before October. That was a miracle for politicians. I mean, don't you think the issue of employment is a political one for all politicians in whatever developed or developing nations?
If you can't solve it, you're not going to stay in office very long. Whether
You're
in
gonna be
China or
kicked
the
out.
United States, you're going to be kicked out. The unemployment issue in China is changing a bit. I mean, a country which is growing 10%, you actually have a problem in terms of getting enough labor. But the growth rate has fallen to 6 or 7. Interestingly, however, the need for workers of the middle skill levels for industrial, many service sectors is not a big issue because the labor force is shrinking in China. But there's an excess of potentially educated, highly skilled coming out. And the question is, where will they be hired? So that's one issue. I think the other issue that's quite different is that the growth slowdown is very differentiated. So in the Northeast, you have a big problem. It's only growing 1 or 2%. The rest of the country is growing 6 or 7. And the unemployed, in terms of workers, state enterprises, very much concentrated in specific lines. So you have some massive potential layoffs coming. Not like it was 5, 10 years ago, even during the global financial crisis. Layoffs were potentially significant for a while, but they were spread more. And then when the economy rebounded, it more or less solved itself. Now it's very concentrated. So now you have issues of unemployment is more educational and regionally differentiated. And this is going to be a little bit more difficult to deal with than it was in the past.
Charles and Yukon, I wonder if both of you noticed a dramatic headline-making story in the middle of the two plenary sessions of NPC and CPPCC in the spring of Beijing. And readers and netizens showed immense interest in industrial strike that took place in Heilongjiang. It concerns the corruption and refusal by the management of a Longmei coal mining group to pay miners and their family relatives in its due course. And recently, the development shows that one of the senior executives of the Longmei group was arrested on charges of huge bribery. I mean, he was involved in a scandal in which he received hundreds of millions of yuan in bribes. He was sentenced to the death penalty with 2 years reprieve. Now, I'm talking about the focal point of unemployment, most of which would occur in the areas of coal, iron, steel, glass, so on and so forth. So will this cause much of the instability in the three northernmost provinces, Heilongjiang, Jilin, Liaoning, where we see a concentration of heavy industry?
There's no question that, as Dr. Huang had just said, it's concentrated in the northeast region. The southern provinces, take Zhejiang, take Fujian, take Guangdong, is still doing quite well. And in fact, the vitality of a city like Shenzhen is beyond imagination. It's just really incredible.
And what do you think of the immense attempt by the central authorities to have what is called the supply side restructuring?
Well, they recognize there's a need, because in the coal and heavy industries in certain sectors, you're essentially going to have to reduce capacity by an enormous amount. So you're talking about, in some cases, 10, 50, even 100,000 workers. You need a special kind of a program. You need support from the center. So there's been money allocated. But nevertheless, carrying it out is politically very sensitive, because there's going to be a lot of displacement. Unfortunately, you're going to have to actually move lots of people. And you're going to have to do it in an organized way. In the past, when it was spread around, more or less, they move themselves. They make that decision, so the political sensitivity is reduced. When it's so concentrated, it's going to be much more visible. And there's going to be a lot of unhappy people who don't want to actually move. But it's going to have to be done, and it's going to come.
Yeah, I would just add, if you looked at the report of the International Energy Agency from 3 days ago, it showed last year was the first year in history that additional power capacity, electricity generating capacity from last year, more were from renewables than from coal or the traditional. So the decline of the coal industry is not just a temporary economic slowdown impact, but it is a long-term trend. And the government has to address this on a long-term basis rather than addressing just temporarily or short-term cyclical economic turnaround.
Here is something debatable, gentlemen. It's about the labor rights, the labor law. Now, a Minister of Commerce complained about the early adoption by the legislature of a labor law which guarantees the minimum income of the ordinary folks. That has definitely added to the costs, painful costs of most of the enterprises, small and medium-sized enterprises of the non-public sector, and dealt a heavy blow to the competitive edge of the non-public sector. Do you think this has seriously hampered or impacted the dynamics of the economy?
Well, you cannot guarantee jobs or salaries for people in industries which no longer are viable. The question is, how do you facilitate their movement? Okay, do you pay them a huge amount of lump sum money and basically say to them, do what you wish? Do you actually facilitate and pay for the transfer and try to find jobs? In the coal sector in some of these areas, you have a real big problem because the skill mix is quite different. You cannot just expect coal workers to become a computer operator, because when people talk about retraining, this just doesn't practically work. So my personal view is that you have to actually have a significant package which allows a person to think seriously about relocating themselves to a different place, to a different province. And that is psychologically and economically a very difficult task. The former Soviet Union, they actually had to do that. They closed down whole towns because they were
over
spread,
200 cities were shut down.
They were spread all around the country, and many of these activities no longer existed. So you had to have a very big formal program of relocation, and it was very costly. But ultimately, it turned out to be no more costly than the credit that the government had to put out every single year to keep these factories going. It's just that they had to make it more visible.
What do you think of the policy option that deficit economy should be preferred to avoid taxing small and medium-sized enterprises? Because non-public investment is seriously absent in the first half of the year, and therefore we see a lot of ironic contradictions in the non-public sector. For example, we have the severe labor shortage for much of the local enterprises. Partly due to the rising labor costs and the commodity prices, but also partly because of the heavy taxation. Now, what do you think of the relationship between deficit economy, deficit policy, and the reduction of taxes?
Fiscal deficit, China has a fiscal deficit. It's not as serious as some Western countries, but there is a deficit. But I think the entire tax structure may need to be revamped a bit in terms of having a fairer tax system, a more comprehensive, broader tax system.
To level the playing field, for
That's
example.
right. We have a situation in which if if you really looked around, not many people are paying taxes the way they are supposed to pay taxes. That's number one. And there are a lot of taxes and other systems which have not been put in place. For example, there's no real capital gains tax. There's no real taxes on real estate. There's no real taxes on many services that the government provides and should be through tax dollars. I want to come back to what Dr. Huang was talking about before in terms of the unemployment issue. It's a question of you have some people who are unemployable in terms of the new economy. This is not just China's problem. This is an issue that is serious in the United States now, where the white-collar workers who used to be middle class, who are auto mechanics, who are working on assembly lines, and so on, are no longer truly employable. But the government over the decades have not done anything to have job training to allow them to be part of the new economy. And I hope China doesn't fall into the same trap.
We are likely to spend hours clarifying the messy situation in domestic market and what policy options would be wise. So let's move elsewhere. For example, let's look at what happened on October the 1st, our national day. The Chinese currency was officially added to the IMF's special joint rights basket, joining the US dollar, the euro, the yen, and the British pound. So what are both the positive and negative financial influences on international transactions and China's overseas investment economy?
Economists look at this issue, I would say, somewhat differently than others, because there are both advantages and disadvantages of having your currency being international. Let me point out that decades ago, when the question was posed to the Germans and the Japanese, do you want the mark of the yen to be international currencies? They both said no. So why is it that they say no when China wants it to be? Well, they pointed out that the currency is going to be international. It's likely that you cannot run trade surpluses. Okay? You're going to have to run some trade deficits because you have to make your currency available globally. And if you're constantly running surplus, everyone pays you, but your currency doesn't get out there. Now, secondly, you also have to free up the movement of your currency, and you lose a little bit of control over the exchange rate and whether or not it's affecting your economy. So in some ways, some countries would say, I don't want it to be global. In the United States, however, its currency is global. The dollar is available everywhere because, one, it has huge trade deficits. It gives it away, okay? And so therefore the dollar is everywhere. So economists have basically pointed out, unlikely the renminbi can be a significant currency overseas because there's no way for the renminbi to be available overseas in that magnitude.
We haven't adopted the full convertibility of the RMB.
We have not.
Or the full opening up of the capital account.
So we're not going to, technically it's not possible. However, the pressure on the system, if you wanted to be a more global currency, reformers would say this is good. It forces China to basically improve its institutions, allow capital to be more freely available, more exchange rate, interest rate flexibility. In the long run, this is desirable. But it also introduces a lot of risk and volatility. And we've seen it already in the last year. China changes the exchange rate a little bit, everyone gets panicky. Money moves out, and people think there's capital flight. But people should realize this is actually part of the process of the currency becoming more international. You have to accept some of these problems if you want also the so-called benefits of having a global currency.
I'm sorry, we don't have enough time to look at the issue of how to develop a social security program to cover the vulnerable social groups such as the left-behind children, the retirees, as well as migrant workers in their millions who are starting to head home after some of the unpredictable things happened in the more prosperous coastal areas in southern China. I promise to come back and examine also the issue of e-commerce and the boom, which may be years ahead of European Union or the United States even. I'll see you next time. Until then, goodbye.